Today, I want to get into something that comes up constantly in my practice, which is the difference between how an avoidant treats someone they're genuinely in love with versus how they treat someone they've basically relegated to placeholder status. And honestly, this is a tricky topic because the line between those two dynamics can get blurry fast, which is exactly why I think this conversation matters. I've touched on pieces of this before because with someone who isn't avoidant, the difference between the person they genuinely love and the person they're simply spending time with is usually obvious. Their behavior follows a consistent emotional logic. When they love someone, they naturally seek closeness. They look for reasons to communicate, to spend time together, to build trust, and to create a shared future. Even during conflict, there's an underlying desire to repair the relationship because the connection itself feels valuable. When someone is only filling time, however, that same consistency simply isn't there. Their attention comes and goes depending on convenience. They may enjoy the companionship, the affection, or the excitement of the relationship, but they don't invest emotionally in the same way. The future remains vague, their effort fluctuates, their commitment often disappears the moment maintaining the relationship requires vulnerability, sacrifice, or sustained emotional investment. Avoidant attachment often makes this distinction much more difficult to recognize. An avoidant person can genuinely develop deep feelings for someone while behaving in ways that seem completely contradictory from the outside. The closer they feel emotionally, the more their attachment system may begin to interpret intimacy as a potential threat rather than a source of comfort. Instead of moving toward the person they care about, they may instinctively create distance. Instead of expressing love openly, they suppress it. Instead of seeking reassurance together, they convince themselves they need more independence. This creates one of the most confusing dynamics in modern relationships. The very person who matters most to the avoidant can become the person they struggle the hardest to stay emotionally close to. That doesn't mean every avoidant partner is deeply in love or that every withdrawal signals hidden feelings. People pull away for many different reasons, including incompatibility or simply deciding the relationship is no longer right for them. But when genuine attachment exists in someone with strong avoidant tendencies, closeness itself can activate fear alongside love. That's why the difference between real love and casual interest often looks almost reversed in avoidant psychology. With someone they don't feel deeply attached to, avoidants frequently appear relaxed and emotionally available. The relationship feels safe because relatively little is at stake emotionally. They can be charming, attentive, affectionate, and spontaneous because they don't feel psychologically vulnerable. There is little fear of losing themselves or becoming emotionally dependent. With someone they truly love, however, the emotional stakes become much higher. Suddenly, every step toward intimacy carries unconscious anxiety. The relationship matters enough to trigger old fears of rejection, engulfment, disappointment, or losing their independence. Their nervous system begins trying to reduce that discomfort by creating emotional distance, even while another part of them desperately wants connection. From the outside, this contradiction often makes no sense. One day they seem deeply invested, sharing vulnerable moments and talking about the future. The next day they become distant, distracted, or emotionally unavailable without any obvious explanation. To the other person, it feels inconsistent. To the avoidant nervous system, it can feel like an attempt to regain emotional equilibrium. This doesn't excuse hurtful behavior, nor does it mean someone should accept chronic inconsistency or emotional neglect. Healthy relationships require communication, accountability, and mutual effort, regardless of attachment style. Understanding avoidant patterns helps explain behavior, but it doesn't remove responsibility for treating a partner with respect. One of the clearest differences is found not in grand romantic gestures, but in what happens internally. Someone merely passing time can usually walk away with relatively little emotional conflict. Someone who has formed a deep attachment often carries the relationship long after the distance begins. They may think about conversations repeatedly, replay memories, wonder how the other person is doing, or feel unexpectedly emotional over reminders they believed no longer affected them. Because avoidants often process emotions privately, much of that internal struggle remains invisible. Their silence isn't always evidence that they feel nothing. Sometimes it's evidence that they haven't yet learned how to tolerate the vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. They may convince themselves they're fine while their thoughts continue returning to the relationship in quiet moments. The deeper truth is this: love doesn't always reveal itself through intensity alone. In healthy relationships, it reveals itself through consistency, emotional responsibility, honesty, and a willingness to keep showing up even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Whether someone has an avoidant attachment style or not, lasting love ultimately depends not only on what they feel, but on what they repeatedly choose to do with those feelings. The behavior looks completely different from one to the other, but avoidants are subtle about love in a way that most other attachment styles simply aren't, so you can end up genuinely confused about which category you actually fall into. And here's what I find so frustrating about this whole situation. So many people convince themselves their partner isn't avoidant, and then they end up treating themselves like a placeholder in their own head, feeling like an afterthought, when in reality, they are the person their partner deeply loves, and their partner just happens to be avoidant. That's actually a good situation to be in, believe it or not, but it's tricky precisely because you might have absolutely no idea that's what's happening. And I really think you deserve to know when someone loves you, even if their way of showing it doesn't look anything like what you expected love to look like. I bring this up because I see it constantly in my work. Someone will come to me convinced their relationship is doomed, convinced they're just the convenient option, the person their partner settles for until something better comes along. And then we start walking through the actual specifics together, and it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that what they're describing isn't indifference at all. It's an avoidant person's clumsy, guarded version of caring deeply. That gap between how it feels to receive avoidant love and what it actually means underneath is exactly what I want to close for you today. So let's start with the first pattern, and I'll call this one recognition seeking. Avoidants, especially dismissive avoidants, tend to want recognition more than people realize, though I'd say both fearful and dismissive avoidants show this to some degree. I've noticed it a bit more often in male avoidants specifically, though that's certainly not a hard rule across the board. So what do I actually mean by recognition seeking? When an avoidant is in love with you, they will sometimes come right out and ask to be acknowledged. And this often happens even when they're upset with you, which throws a lot of people off completely. You'll hear things like, "Isn't this enough for you? Can't you see everything I do for you? I feel like nothing I do is ever good enough." And people's first reaction is usually, "Wow, this person is angry. This person is upset with me." And sure, that's true on the surface, but here's the important part to understand. Negative emotion is not the opposite of love. Indifference is the actual opposite of love. So when an avoidant gets frustrated like this, it's because they care about you deeply, and it feels like that caring just isn't registering with you the way they need it to. They genuinely don't know how to communicate what they're feeling in a cleaner way. Think about it like this. Say you're someone with an anxious, preoccupied attachment style, and you're genuinely frustrated with your partner. You might say something like, "Why didn't you text me when you got home? I was worried sick. I feel like you never call me anymore. I feel like you don't even like me half the time." You're not saying any of that because you hate them. You're saying it because you love them, and it's not translating the way you want it to. It's honestly the exact same emotional mechanism at work, just wearing a different outfit. The reason this is worth spelling out is because when it's an avoidant expressing that same underlying frustration, it comes out looking almost unrecognizable compared to how an anxious person expresses it, even though the root feeling driving it is identical. An anxious person tends to reach for you louder when they're scared of losing your attention. An avoidant tends to push against you harder, almost like they're testing whether you'll still be standing there once the tension passes. Both are really just asking the same underlying question: do you actually see me? Does what I do for you actually register? It just gets delivered in completely opposite packaging depending on the attachment style involved. Now, the placeholder version of this looks nothing like that at all, and once you know what to look for, it's actually pretty distinct. Someone who's a placeholder to an avoidant isn't going to seek recognition from you because there's no real emotional attachment underneath it to fuel that need. You are simply never going to hear that kind of frustrated plea for acknowledgement from them, even if you've been together for a couple of years, which, to be honest, is a fairly unlikely scenario to begin with. I could honestly wrap this whole video up in about a minute for most of you, because in general, if you've been with an avoidant partner for longer than about a year, you are almost certainly not the placeholder. I'm being completely straightforward with you here. Even if it feels that way sometimes, it's usually just not true. Avoidants don't stick around with people they don't actually like because they would genuinely rather be alone than deal with the emotional labor of a relationship that means nothing to them. If they're still with you, that tells you something real is there, even if the relationship runs hot and cold. And this even extends to situations that live in that weird gray zone, like when you're in something with an avoidant that functions like a relationship, but nobody's actually calling it that. I've had calls with plenty of you about exactly this, and obviously I keep every single one of those conversations completely confidential. I would never share specifics about anyone's individual situation. But speaking generally, a lot of the calls I've had recently involve this exact dynamic, where it looks like friendship on paper, but functions like something much deeper. When we actually break it down together in a session, it becomes pretty clear pretty fast that we're basically describing a real relationship, just one without a label attached to it. If you've heard me talk about this pattern before, you probably already know exactly what I'm referring to. But here's the key distinction. You are not a placeholder in that scenario because there is real, tangible momentum behind the connection. If there's no momentum at all and there's no visible desire for recognition from them, then there's likely no real emotional attachment underneath it either. And that's much closer to what an actual placeholder situation looks like. I really want you all to internalize this. If you're watching content like mine, statistically, the overwhelming majority of you, I'd say somewhere around 90 to 95%, are not the placeholder in your relationship. But for that small percentage of you who genuinely are, I want you to have the clarity to walk away from that because you deserve better than being someone's placeholder. That's actually a big part of why I'm putting this video together in the first place. If you're struggling to figure out where you stand in your own relationship, you're always welcome to book a call with me directly or send me an email. We can go through the specifics together and work toward answering some of the questions that have been sitting unresolved in the back of your mind. What's actually happening in your relationship? What can realistically be done about it? I'm genuinely equipped to help you work through those questions. I see an enormous number of couples and individual clients in my practice, and I've developed a lot of insight into these relational dynamics over the years. I want you to know up front that I'm not going to sit there and judge you for anything you share with me. So please feel free to give me as much background as you're comfortable sharing, because the more context I have, the better equipped I am to give you a genuinely useful answer and help you figure out what's actually best for your situation. That information is available in the description box below, and I always pin it in the comments too. Moving on to the next pattern, which is honesty. Now, this one doesn't always apply cleanly to fearful avoidance. So if you're with a fearful avoidant and this particular point doesn't seem to fit your situation, that doesn't necessarily mean anything is wrong, because fearful avoidants operate a bit differently here, and I'll get into the specifics of why in a moment. Generally speaking, when an avoidant genuinely loves you, they value who you are as a person, and that shows up as a kind of honesty, even when the truth might sting a little. However, this is where fearful avoidants tend to diverge, because they're carrying that underlying abandonment wound, which makes them genuinely afraid that being fully honest with you might drive you away. So fearful avoidants might actually avoid this particular behavior altogether. If someone leans very strongly into avoidant patterns overall, sure, it's possible you'll still see this honesty show up, but typically it doesn't play out that way for them. Usually if you ask an avoidant partner, and this is more common with dismissive avoidance specifically, they'll tell you something like, "I'm honest with you even when it might disappoint you because I respect you too much to lie." Now compare that to someone who's treating you as a placeholder, and again, we're not talking about fearful avoidance in this comparison. Someone in placeholder mode might lie to you simply to avoid rocking the boat because they have zero real investment in where this relationship is headed. They're not expecting you to grow. They're not expecting you to respect them the way a real partner would. And frankly, they don't care about any of that dynamic at all. For them, this whole thing is temporary and disposable by nature. It's worth pointing out why this distinction matters so much practically. Honesty, even the uncomfortable kind, requires a person to believe the relationship is sturdy enough to absorb the truth. A dismissive avoidant who genuinely loves you has essentially made a calculation, even if it's not a fully conscious one, that telling you something you might not want to hear is worth the temporary discomfort because the connection itself is worth protecting long term. Someone in placeholder mode has made the opposite calculation without even realizing it. Since there's nothing long-term worth protecting, there's no reason to risk any friction at all. So smoothing things over with a small lie in the moment costs them absolutely nothing. The next pattern worth discussing is how they handle conflict. This one actually shows up in both fearful and dismissive avoidance, just expressed differently. Generally speaking, they're not going to go completely blank and act totally unbothered by conflict the way a placeholder treating avoidant would. A fearful avoidant might shut down entirely when conflict arises, and I mean shut down hard, sometimes going days without really talking to you at all. Dismissive avoidance can react strongly too, though it tends to be a bit more obvious with fearful avoidance specifically. With dismissive avoidance, I more commonly see irritation or straightforward anger surface instead. But regardless of which type you're dealing with, both fearful and dismissive avoidance will show some kind of reaction during conflict, even if that reaction looks very particular to their style. That doesn't mean the reaction itself is healthy. To be clear, I'm not saying any of this is a good coping mechanism. I'm simply describing what actually tends to happen. That emotional reaction, however messy it looks, is still a genuine sign of real investment in you and the relationship. They might shut down completely and avoid the conversation entirely, but that's usually because they're overwhelmed by their own feelings, not because they're disinterested in you. They might even try to steer things away from the hard conversation altogether, saying something like, "Let's just be happy, let's not go there right now," when it's actually pretty obvious to a trained eye that they're wrestling with a lot underneath the surface. Compare that to how someone treats an actual placeholder. In that scenario, they're going to be almost eerily nonchalant about conflict. They barely seem to care what you're even saying to them. There's no real investment there, and you genuinely cannot get much of an emotional rise out of them, simply because they don't have any real emotional stake in you as a person. This distinction trips a lot of people up because they assume a strong reaction during conflict automatically equals a bad or toxic dynamic, and a calm, unbothered reaction automatically equals emotional maturity. But that's not quite right when you're specifically trying to figure out where you stand with an avoidant. The calm, checked-out response is usually the more telling one here, not the intense one. If your partner gets visibly rattled, defensive, or shuts down hard after a disagreement, that discomfort is doing a lot of quiet work. It's telling you the stakes actually feel high to them. Someone treating you as a placeholder simply doesn't have stakes riding on the outcome of that conversation at all. Next up is awareness, meaning how attuned they are to your moods, your feelings, even your everyday preferences. This tends to show up a bit more with fearful avoidants overall, and especially with fearful avoidant men, though you'll see traces of it in dismissive avoidance too, just less consistently. Fearful avoidance in particular can become almost hyper-vigilant about your emotional state. They might even go out of their way to avoid you when you seem to be in a bad mood, just to sidestep any potential conflict. Let me give you an example from actual couples therapy I've done. Say I'm working with a couple where the husband is avoidant, and it honestly doesn't matter what attachment style the wife has for this example. Let's just say she's dealing with her menstrual cycle that particular week. He might start thinking to himself, okay, she's probably going to be a bit more on edge, maybe more tired than usual, maybe quicker to get frustrated. Should I even ask her out to dinner this week? Should I offer to cook? Or is that overstepping somehow? He ends up tiptoeing around her constantly, even though she genuinely hasn't done anything wrong, purely because he's so tuned into her emotional state and he's telling himself, I'm aware of what she's feeling. I know I struggle with handling emotions well, but I love her and I don't want to make things worse for her, even though I'm genuinely bad at this whole emotional navigation thing. So what do I even do here? He ends up looking completely lost and overwhelmed by his own good intentions. We see this exact pattern come up constantly in couples therapy. And it's not that he doesn't love his wife, because he absolutely does. It's just that she might not interpret his behavior that way at all, simply because she doesn't fully understand what's actually driving it. A placeholder, by contrast, typically won't show any of that hyper-awareness. They might completely forget small details about you that matter. They're not particularly interested in making you feel better when you're struggling, and they're definitely not hyper-attuned to your emotional state the way someone who actually loves you would be. You could be visibly upset in front of them, and they'd barely register it, let alone start quietly adjusting their own behavior around it the way that husband, in my example, was doing without even being asked. A lot of you already know this from first-hand experience if you're in a relationship with an avoidant, and if you've had a call with me before, we've almost certainly touched on this exact point. Avoidants react to your emotions far more than they let on. They'll act like nothing phases them, but underneath that surface, they absolutely do react. They'll shut down, they'll pull away emotionally, and if they're fearful avoidant specifically, you'll often see jealousy surface too. You already know this if you've lived it. Sometimes it's tempting to talk yourself out of recognizing this pattern, to tell yourself that's not actually what's happening here, because on paper it can sound almost too simple or too convenient to be true. But it really is true. A lot of avoidants genuinely do react this way underneath the surface. And if someone in your life truly isn't reacting to you at all, that's usually a pretty strong indicator that you're dealing with placeholder treatment instead. The next thing worth talking about is change, and this particular pattern really only becomes visible in longer-term relationships. If you've only been together for a year, or even 2 years, this might not have surfaced yet in your relationship. It likely will eventually, but maybe not right now. When an avoidant genuinely loves you, they'll eventually acknowledge that they're actively working on themselves. A lot of times this comes out sounding almost defensive, something like, "Stop pressuring me, I'm working on it, you have no idea how much effort I'm actually putting into this." And it might come across as harsh in the moment. But here's the thing, they actually are doing the work behind the scenes. So please don't respond to that kind of statement with something like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, you don't have to change for me." Don't do that, because it undercuts the real effort they're putting in. Let them show up on their own timeline. Let them take the time they genuinely need, but also let them push themselves when it counts. It doesn't always have to feel comfortable in the moment, but when they say something like, "I'm working on it, just give me some space," that is a legitimate sign of real growth happening, even if the delivery is a little rough around the edges sometimes. A placeholder, on the other hand, might promise to change within the first couple of days of being called out on something, but you'll notice there's zero actual follow-through behind those words. There's no real emotional frustration or investment driving it. it, because honestly, they're not doing anything differently at all. They're just handing you empty words to keep you quiet, essentially just lip service with nothing behind it. The real tell here is the emotional charge attached to the promise, or the lack of one. When someone who loves you says they're working on something, there's usually visible discomfort behind it, a kind of internal friction you can sense even if they're being short with you about it. When a placeholder says the same words, there's no friction at all. It comes out smooth and easy precisely because it was never going to require anything of them in the first place. The next pattern is communication, and this one leans much more heavily toward fearful avoidance specifically, because dismissive avoidants tend to do this with virtually anyone in their life, so this particular point might barely apply to dismissive avoidance at all, in terms of distinguishing love from placeholder treatment. Fearful avoidants, though, will genuinely start speaking up and expressing things that make them uncomfortable when they're falling for you. Dismissive avoidants, on the other hand, will do this kind of direct communication with practically anyone, even a total stranger, even a waiter at a restaurant. They'll say something like, "Hey, I don't like that," immediately and without hesitation. Fearful avoidants are the opposite. They genuinely hate rocking the boat, as we touched on earlier. So if a fearful avoidant starts speaking up and saying something like, "Hey, honestly, I think you can come across as a little needy sometimes. I don't know a gentler way to put that. I don't mean to hurt your feelings by saying it." That's a meaningful shift for some fearful avoidance specifically. Dismissive avoidance might start showing a different version of this as they heal and grow emotionally. You might notice them becoming almost overly apologetic in a way they weren't before, actually. That's something I personally went through because I used to be pretty abrasive earlier in my own life, and then I started overcorrecting by becoming excessively apologetic because I genuinely didn't know where I might unintentionally step on someone's toes. So if a dismissive avoidant is actively healing, you might start noticing that kind of overly careful communication showing up more often. But with fearful avoidance specifically, this particular shift is really about bonding with you, which is a different mechanism entirely from healing in general. You can have a fearful avoidant who's still very much unhealed in most other areas of their life, and yet you'll still see them start doing this specific thing the moment they fall in love with you. A placeholder, though, shows absolutely none of this. They have no real interest in opening up to you or exploring their emotional world with you, simply because there's no genuine attachment underneath it all driving that vulnerability. So if you've been sitting there trying to figure out which category you actually fall into, go back through these signs honestly, rather than through the lens of how hurt or confused you might be feeling in any given week. Recognition, honesty, how they handle conflict, how attuned they are to you, whether they're actually working on themselves, and how much they're willing to communicate the uncomfortable stuff, all of that adds up to a much clearer picture than any single bad day ever could. I really hope this breakdown helps clarify things for at least a few of you out there watching. If it did, go ahead and like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next one.